First up is former ITV royal correspondent and author Nicholas Owen. Welcome back to the show. This interview with Gabor Mate, I think we all saw the potential for it to be another rather inwardly focused exercise from Prince Harry. Is that what we got?
I think it was, frankly. It was extraordinary, really, wasn't it? It was a therapy session, as Harry himself said at one stage, a therapy session he got free, with masses of advice from this character, or the Dr. Gabor Mate. All sorts of extraordinary things in it. When I was reading through the transcripts of it, because I didn't actually sit down and watch the whole thing. I've seen so much of young Harry that I thought I'd just read about it this time. But there's masses and masses of stuff in it. But it seemed to me to be coming back to the same points all the time. Talking about the way his family, dysfunctional family really, the absolute importance of his children to him, the fact that Meghan is so important, absolutely crucial to his life, which is not surprising really. She'd kind of rescued him. And there were a few sort of new things. It seems almost impossible to think that much new could come out, but there was a little bit new. He said that he was taking cannabis had helped him a bit, but cocaine had not. So it obviously indulged in all those sorts of things. And the other interesting line I thought, which didn't perhaps get as much attention as it should, but I think this is very important. The business of Afghanistan, the fighting in Afghanistan. Harry made a lot of fuss about the fact that he'd been out there, killed a lot of Taliban fighters and so on. He now revealing and saying that, well, of course, a lot of the soldiers, didn't really agree with what we were doing, and I didn't really agree with it. Sort of disagreeing with the sort of main thrust of the reason why soldiers like him were there. That was a bit new, but otherwise very inward looking, very much talking about how he felt about his mother and his family and all those things. Curious business, very strange way to do things, you have to admit.
Yeah, it is a bit of a strange way to go about it. Here's a short clip of what he had to say. This is him in his own words.
The times that I ventured towards being myself, being my authentic, true self, for one shape or another, whether it was through media or family or whatever it was almost like don't be yourself. Come back to what you're expected to be.
I feel like we've heard this before. I'm not sure whether those sorts of comments are truly new. Other than the Afghanistan comments, do you think there was anything that was particularly insightful?
No, not really, to be honest. I think we're sort of going round and round the same sorts of point, aren't we? I think he keeps coming back to the talking about his mother. I think you and I, Caroline, we discussed this before, didn't we, about this business of I lost my mother when I was very young as well. For Harry, a pivotal moment in his life, he was only 12 years old when he lost his mum and so on, keeps going back to the sort of person she was, and he feels he's the same way and so on. And I think an awful lot of people would just say, oh, come along, sir. Feel sorry for the fact that you lost your mum when you were so young. Of course, we all feel desperate about that. But to base the rest of your life on it, to keep on and on and on about it, I don't think serves any purpose at all, to be honest.
And here, you touched on earlier his relationship with Meghan. Here's what he had to say on that.
My partner is an exceptional human being, and I'm eternally grateful for the wisdom and the space that she's been able to give to me.
This seems to me to be pretty similar to what we've heard previously. Why do we keep going around the same mountain?
Well, I think Meghan's at the very centre of his life, understandably, and his two children, and Archie and Lilibet and so on. That's his anchor, isn't it, if you like? And perhaps that's understandable in a way. The other thing that came up, we didn't have it in that actual clip, did we? But he also talked again at some stage about when he brought his wife to this country, to the UK, where I am now, the racism that was encountered. This, again, he comes back to this point, Meghan facing racism, which is such a puzzle to us here, all of us here, whether you're sympathetic to Prince Harry or you're not sympathetic to him, however you feel about the way things have turned out. Racism, it's just so curious that he comes back to that word every time.
Yeah, he does seem to, and from my recollection, I remember that Britons and the British media were really very excited when the couple first got together, and since then we've had the Oprah interview, we've had the Netflix series, we've had the book, and then we've had this online therapy session. I mean, what is the ripple effect here? Not just for the royal family itself, but for the broader public sentiment.
Well, it's a very good question, because I think almost the more that Harry has to say about things, the less he gets support in this country. He says he doesn't worry. One of the things he mentioned to the Gabor Mate was that he wasn't worried about the reaction. It didn't faze him at all, the way people had responded to his book. He took a lot of pride in the way it had been written and so on. So, well, perhaps he should. It has been a bestseller worldwide. But I just think that this sort of drip of things has not really changed. Certainly people who are anti-Harry, he's not done anything for them at all. I think a lot of people who might have been quite sympathetic to him beginning to feel less and less so. And here's another point that I may have made this before, but I think it's very important. What do you do next? How do you follow up on this? Because it's all very well to come out with all this stuff, but what's the next step? What's your next selling point? What's he going to do? Is he going to make a movie? Perhaps he will. I mean, perhaps that's the next thing. Perhaps he's going to be in a movie, going to be an action hero or something. I don't know. But it's very, very hard to see where this couple, how they keep this sort of momentum going, keep finding ways to get their story, get his story across. And I'm afraid the more he does it, the more he is liable to, frankly, alienate people rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that's entirely possible, but please stop giving them ideas. Look, still on the Sussexes, we understand they were asked to leave Frogmore Cottage the day after Prince Harry released his memoir, Spare. Can you fill us in on the timeline of events?
Well, you're right. So out comes this book, Spare. Incidentally, the title says it all. It's all really about his feeling of being removed. There's always going to be William in the way, Bear in mind that Harry is only a fifth in line to the throne, so it's not that he's liable at any point to become king of this country. It's not that. But it's just the feeling that William will always be in the way. So the book comes out, and the next thing we know, he's told, I'm sorry, Frogmore Cottage, I love the expression cottage. I don't know about you Australians, but a cottage here is something quite small and modest, well, very pretty and nice and so on. This is a 12-bed. This got 12 bedrooms, this thing. They've spent an enormous amount of money, millions of British pounds, doing it up. Money that eventually, it has to be said, Prince Harry repaid, so perhaps he'll have to get the money back. But the day after, he gets told, I'm sorry, we don't want you back. You can't have Frogmore Cottage anymore. But the important thing about that, it's not just a matter of property. It's a very important thing that as long as he had that property here, he could be said to be domiciled in this country. And without it, and now he's over in the States, it makes coming back here very, very difficult for him. So it's quite a big move. I mean, I think there was a great deal of shock when this came out. I really did. Quite an extraordinary thing. And the irony is that he's being moved out while Prince Andrew, his uncle, who's had enormous problems of his own, and his public image is right through the floor as well, he's been told that he's got to leave another very smart property, Royal Lodge, which is very grand indeed, in the same area, very close to Windsor Castle. He's been told he's got to move out of Royal Lodge and he's got to go into this Frogmore Cottage. And there's yet another problem with that, because although Prince Andrew is divorced from, and everybody knows from his wife, from Sarah, but the point is that she has been living with him. They've been living together, or living in the same house anyway, probably separate lives to some extent. Well, when she gets to whether he goes to the cottage, is she going to go with him as well? So many things, so many fascinating things about this.
Who knows, we'll have to wait and see. But you're right, it is really quite a big move. But how do you think it reflects on King Charles?
Well, it shows, I think, that the King is determined to make his view very clear, that Harry has burnt his bridges. What do you do? Do you burn bridges, or do you burn boats, or do you burn both? I don't know, but you know what I mean. The king is really saying, look, you've decided that your life is going to be basically in America. You've decided that you're going to speak out at every turn about all the things that go wrong in our family and have gone wrong down the years and so on, from his point of view. And so I'm very sorry. This is, and so the king is, the thing about the Windsor family generally, our late Queen, beloved figure, absolutely beloved figure. But these are tough guys, you know. You've got to sort of, if you're in the big job, particularly when you're actually on the throne, sentiment somehow has to take often, most of the time I would say, has to take second place to the realities. And I think it's showing that this king is very capable of doing that, even with his own family. Being very forbearing so far, most people would say. Don't forget that as far as one can tell, there's all sorts of stories going around about what people really think, what the king really thinks, what William, the brother, who incidentally, William got no mention at all in that interview with Gabor Mate, wasn't mentioned at all, quite extraordinary.
I'm also wondering how this is reflecting in the US. There is some contention as to whether celebrity life is working out as well for the Sussexes as they may have hoped for. What are the schools of thought saying here?
Well, this is an interesting point about what's happening in America. The phrase that was often used, that when they went over there, they would be treated like Hollywood royalty, was the phrase that was used. But, you know, I've always been very sceptical about that, because I think the problem is that in Hollywood, royalty is people like, I don't know, I've got sort of a quick list I made up here. The Kardashians, obviously, Beyonce, Sharon Stone, any number of movie stars that you can think of, and stars of social media too, TikTok and all the other things that nowadays. And I was always sceptical of the idea that they would really be so high up the pecking order. And actually now there's a TV presenter called Nick Ede, who's pretty respected there, and his view is that they are pretty far down the pecking order, the royal couple. They might have thought they were going to be absolutely at the top, they were going to be the head of everybody's invitation, everybody was going to want them all the time, and he says no, I'm awfully sorry, they're slipped pretty far down the pecking order, frankly. There was a lot of interest in them at the beginning, of course there was, particularly with the way they burst on the scene with the famous interview with Oprah Winfrey. But once the sort of initial excitement had died down, they're going to find invitations, I think, a little bit more difficult to get, frankly. A bit of a sad thing. It's a terrible reminder of times past, when Edward VIII left the throne back in the 1930s because he married an American divorcee lady. There's an extraordinary thing. Gradually, the sort of big invitations petered out and they were left rather isolated, and I'm afraid the same thing seems to be happening again.
Now, lastly, before we go, and this is now going to the coronation, apparently there's a power struggle over invitations to the coronation. Now, that all sounds rather loaded. Can you explain what the point of friction is?
Well, I think it's really a matter mostly of numbers, because at the coronation of Her Majesty the Queen back in 1953, there was a vast number of people got into Westminster Abbey. When you look at the old grainy black and white pictures, they were packed in, absolutely. I can't remember the actual numbers. I think it was well over 4,000, 5,000 people, something of that sort. Well, now the numbers are going to be reduced back to about 2,000. So obviously there's going to be enormous struggles on who gets in. But behind that, there's also the question of who is actually organising this thing, because it's supposed to be the job of somebody called the Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, one of these strange sort of British ways, the aristocracy here, the way it behaves. But it doesn't look as though he's having much to do with it, really. It's really being handed on to sort of a lot of other people, civil servants and government officials and things. So there's a lot of toing and froing. It will be fascinating to see how this turns out, who will actually get to see it. But I must bring you one very up-to-date bit of information just come through, and this is going to excite people an awful lot here. The pubs are going to be allowed to stay open for an extra 2 hours on Coronation Day, because we still have rather strict rules about when pubs close. But no, we're all going to get 2 hours of extra drinking to say, God save the King. Well done. Cheers, Charles.
Well, that's definitely going to add to the mood. And thank you, Nicholas, for joining us this evening. We look forward to our next chat.